Wonderful oceans. Before we do, if you find yourself in North Texas, please avail yourself to our Discovery Center. Discovery Center has nothing to do with Ken Ham's Ark or his museum in Kentucky, which is fine, and I've been there several times and all. This is a completely new display, creation science display in North Texas. You will thoroughly enjoy yourself. And speaking of which, we do have a model of a T-Rex, life-sized T-Rex. Kids absolutely love it, and it is anatomically correct, complete with all the sound effects that you would expect. Plus, there are other displays. You could easily spend one full day there looking at all there is to see at the ICR Discovery Center. Okay, and God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And so that's my introductory verse to our oceans, 330 million cubic miles of ocean, covering about 73% of the surface of this planet. And the average depth of the ocean, as I'd mentioned this morning, is 2.5 miles. So that's a lot of water. And the oceans are what we call a heat sink. They actually help to buffer any kind of radical changes that otherwise might occur on planet Earth. The oceanic conditions help to buffer that so that we don't experience severe climate type changes and all. And so Earth should have little or no water. Did you know that? As an inner system planet, solar system planet, Earth should have little or no water, according to an evolutionist writing just 3 short years ago. Because, of course, the twin of Earth is Venus. And Venus has temperatures at least 500 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface. And Earth, although Earth and Venus are supposedly twins, Earth is so incredibly different than Venus. It's a big mystery for the evolutionist as to why this should be so, but we see that according to evolution, Earth should have little or no water. But folks, we are awash with all sorts of water on this planet. Speaking of which, this is a picture from a weather satellite taken 22,000 miles out in space, showing that indeed this is called the water planet because of so much water. And as an evolutionist said, well, no, just another quote, surface water is important for stabilizing Earth's climate over long periods of time, and that's what I mentioned just a few minutes ago. And so this is another picture taken from the same weather satellite showing just how amazing this planet is, how it's covered with liquid water. And this is where two evolutionists, Garrison and Ellis, they're both atheists out of California, writing in their oceanography book that planet must be large enough that its gravity will keep the atmosphere and the ocean from drifting off into space. And I hate it when that happens. And so we find that Earth is designed to maintain gravity and the atmosphere and the ocean and everything else. Everything, as I'd said so often before, is just right. Another quote from the Royal Astronomical Society out of England. They said just a few years ago, the sheer strength of Earth's magnetic field helps to maintain liquid water on our blue planet's surface, thereby making it possible for life to thrive. The evolutionists can only say, wow, isn't it interesting that it worked out that way? And yet we find everything is so exquisitely designed to help maintain life on this planet. I said again earlier this morning that the moon, our lives are absolutely dependent upon the moon and its structure and everything else about it, even up to its distance from Earth and everything else is just right. And so let's take a look at just one drop of the seawater magnified 25 times, and here's what it looks like. So that's a drop of seawater, and I'm a distant swimmer. Whenever I get near the coast or the ocean, I find any excuse I can to get out in the water and start doing a lot of swimming. It seems to me it's the most satisfactory way of exercise and all. But this is what the ocean water looks like, and occasionally you'll get a mouth of seawater if you like to swim, and there you go, bottoms up. Isn't that delicious there? So speaking of which, I think maybe we should all take a long drink of seawater. Would you like that? Yeah, nod your head. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that right now. Well, anyway. But, and so this is a seawater. And by the way, every other breath that you're taking this afternoon is due to the oceanic life. In other words, blue-green algae. Blue-green algae implies photosynthesis. And we remember photosynthesis from high school. Remember that? How boring that was to study it and all. But plankton supply half of the atmosphere is oxygen. That's why I say every other breath you're taking right now is due to the material in the ocean, the photosynthetic material in the ocean there, and it looks something like this. Well, a single sand grain harbors up to 100,000 microorganisms from thousands of species, according to an evolutionist writing in 2017 in Science Daily. So that's just a single grain of sand. You can see the magnified sand grains here, and that they are a source, not a source, but it acts a surface for this bacteria to proliferate. Sand-dwelling bacteria play an important role in the marine ecosystem, and the sand acts as an enormous purifying filter. So again, God has everything under control. Everything is balanced out so perfectly, so exquisitely. But you know, there's also a kind of a negative side that could possibly happen, and that is when you have all this water in the ocean, it is a perfect source for bacteria to get out of control and start growing explosively, because you have just the right amount of sunlight that helps a bacteria to grow. Obviously, you have a lot of moisture. You've got a lot of nutrients. What is to stop a runaway growth of bacteria in the oceans until pretty soon the oceans could, possibly get overwhelmed with bacteria? Now, obviously, that doesn't happen. And it wasn't found out until several decades ago that there are specific species of viruses, and we've heard a lot of viruses due to the COVID outbreak, right? Well, there are species of viruses that the Lord Jesus has created that specifically infect bacteria. And those kinds of viruses that infect bacteria are called bacteriophages, or phages for short. And these phages do nothing more than to infect bacteria. So the bacteria are proliferating. These phages, or bacteriophages, land on the bacteria, inject their DNA, and cause the bacteria to lyse, and that is to explode after there's been a lot of reproduction of the viral particles inside the bacteria, upwards of totally overturning over 75% of the bacteria that would normally overwhelm the oceans. Over 75% are killed approximately every 24-hour period. And this is a cyclic phenomenon that goes on and on, 24 hours, on and on and on, just to maintain the right level of bacterial proliferation in the oceans. Not too much, not too little. As Goldilocks says, you bet. And so let's talk about the origin of the ocean. How about the origin? I like that because, of course, the origin of anything looks at a biblical foundation. That is until 1859. And in 1859, a young, mild-mannered English naturalist by the name of, what was his name? Charles Darwin, decided that he was going to write a book entitled The Origin of Species, published in 1859. You know, every Christian should know a couple of things about Darwin's infamous book. Number one is what year it was published. Number two is the full title. The full title was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. I think that's kind of Well, it's an overtly racist title, is it not? If he's talking about the favored races, that means some races, according to Darwin, are not favored. And so that's why in American public schools and colleges and universities, you never see the full title of Darwin's book, because everybody knows it's a racist title. So let's just shorten it to The Origin of Species. What's one problem with that? Well, one thing Darwin never talked about was the origin of the species. He never got around to discussing that. And also, another problem, and every Christian should know this, that Darwin's book was not scientific. It was kind of superficial. He talked a lot about what we call wild rock pigeons. Have you ever seen a wild rock pigeon? Yeah, everybody has. They're the kind of pigeons you see around city statues and barns. And Darwin, with his buddies in the Kent area where he lived, I believe, liked to raise pigeons. There's nothing wrong with that. And sure enough, Darwin and his buddies would raise varieties of the wild rock pigeons. And he talked all about that in Origin of the Species, as if that's evidence for evolution. Well, let's throw that out this afternoon. Is that evidence for real vertical evolution? Answer is absolutely not. It's still a 100% bird, but more importantly, it's 100% pigeons. There we go. So not only is there still 100% pigeons, but there's still 100% birds, but there's still 100% pigeons. Folks, that's not real vertical evolution at all. That's just variation within the created kind. You've already heard me talk about variation of the created kind, such as dogs and cats and roses, 30,000 different varieties of roses, but they're still roses, you bet. And so with Darwin's infamous book, he never described the origin of species. Well, Frank, why is everybody so gaga over Darwin's Origin of the Species? Well, the answer, and this is important, the answer is his book was not popular because of the science. We already established that there's no real science there, it's just minor variation. Folks, his book was popular because he explained creation without a creator. He explained creation without a creator. That's why Darwin's book was taken by storm in 1859, and why it is still somewhat popular today. It has nothing to do with science and everything to do with a religion or philosophy, if you will. And so that's Darwin's infamous Origin of the Species. But let's talk about the ocean, or the origin of the ocean. Secular science doesn't know where the oceans came from. The origin, there's that key word, of the water in the oceans is what? Unclear. Here's another quote in 2009. The origin, there's that word again, of water on earth is still puzzling. Well, if you're going to reject the biblical teaching of the origin of everything, then it's always going to be a puzzle. That's what I helped to establish, at least yesterday, when evolutionists don't like to talk about creation, and yet they're wringing their hands saying, where did mankind come from? From what creature did man spring up from? Subhuman type primate creature. And so they'll never find a satisfactory answer to that, because we did not evolve from some subhuman primate creature, allegedly 6 to 8 million years ago, depending on what evolutionist you talk to. By the way, 1 million of anything is a lot, isn't it? Okay, except for dollars. But to say that there's that much variation, 6 to 8 million years, are you kidding me? That's why all of these greatly inflated ages, what we call deep age, really doesn't mean anything. How about it, folks? Is this scientific? Quote, "It's fascinating to realize that when you drink a glass of water, most of the molecules were made up more than 4.5 billion years ago in the cloud from which our sun and planets formed," end quote. Is that a scientific statement? Remember the nature of science, that which we can observe and test and repeat, right? That's what we call empirical science. So if somebody says to you, well, that's not empirical, what they really mean is it's not observable, testable, or repeatable. And folks, this is not observable, testable, or repeatable because it only happened 4.5 billion years ago. So you have to take by faith that water that you are drinking came from what the evolutionist says it did, but there is no way to establish that, folks. There's no way to prove it. It's simply based on evolutionary naturalism. And this is what I was talking about, Venus and Earth, the Earth's evil twin. Why doesn't Venus have any water? Good question. It's an inner solar system planet just like Earth. Venus is almost identical to Earth in size and mass, and even its location is closer to Earth than any other planet. Wouldn't Venus get hit with just as many comets and asteroids? And yet there's virtually no water. Now, what the author here is talking about is that supposedly, and this was popular for decades, Earth got all of its water due to what we call cosmic water balloons. Okay, that since there's no God, no creator, and yet this planet is lousy with water, where did all that water come from? And so they float the hypothesis, no pun intended, that maybe there was a whole bunch of water brought in through the alleged billions of years that peppered this planet with these cometary water balloons. And that slowly but surely the water would accumulate until somebody started punching out the numbers, crunching the numbers, and they realized, look, even with a planet that's as old as what they maintain Earth to be, you would never get that many asteroids and comets peppering this planet. And so the Soviets, 30 plus years ago, were sending surveys to Venus. And this is what they see. This is a radar imaging from one of the Soviet spacecraft on the surface of Venus, and only lasted about 25 or 30 minutes. And they had a special lens that was made of a diamond, so that could survive the heat. And even then, the heat was so brutal on this particular spacecraft. It only lasted a half hour, 40 minutes or so. But it gets extremely, extremely hot, and so unlike what we see, obviously, here on planet Earth, except for Texas, okay? So, secular scientists are suggesting a novel, and that is a biblical, as I would say, idea regarding the origin of the Earth's ocean. And that is, according to Science magazine, a good 13 years ago, the secular scientist is saying Earth oceans were homegrown. What's he saying? He's saying that this planet looks like it had water all the time. Where else do we read that? The Spirit of God moved across the surface of the waters. When? In the beginning. So in the beginning, Earth always had water, according to the biblical model. How did Earth get its water? It seems it had it all along, according to New Scientist, which, by the way, is no friend of the creationist, and this was written back in 2015. It seems it had it all along. In other words, according to Genesis, the earth began as a watery chaos not that long ago, so water was paramount from when? The beginning. The beginning. Here it is. The water that made Earth a majestic blue marble was here from the time of our planet's birth, according to a new study of ancient meteorites scientists reported, and this is back in 2014. So slowly but surely, they're starting to come to a biblical understanding of where the water came from. Does that remind you of what I shared with you this morning about now the evolutionists are admitting that this planet suffered what? A worldwide catastrophe. And they attribute that to a giant asteroid. We talk about a worldwide catastrophe called the Genesis flood. So, when the evolutionists jump on board and say, yeah, there was a worldwide catastrophe, I tell you what, they are talking about something that is just incredibly, incredibly violent. And that is by this supposed speculated giant asteroid that struck supposedly the Yucatan Peninsula. So all of a sudden now they've jumped on board and they're talking about a worldwide catastrophe. How about all this planet covered in water? Well, this is what the Bible taught since the beginning, And guess what? Within the last couple of decades now, evolutionists are talking about this planet being covered with water in the past, just like what the Bible said. And now here we have it again. Example number 3, where evolutionists, instead of trying to say how this planet came up with all water, they're simply saying from the time of our planet's birth. It sounds pretty biblical to me, folks. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness is upon the face of the deep. Look at this. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the what? The waters. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2. The Bible states our planet began cool and covered with water, as opposed to the secular model stating there was molten rock with no water. And so the Bible's right. The Bible got it right ever since when? The beginning. Very good. Ever since the beginning. Creation does have the answer. Here the Apostle Paul is giving his apologia, his apologetic, sharing with the skeptics on Mars Hill and saying, men, why are you doing these things? We are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things, these vanities, to the living God. Did you get that? To the living God. One and only. He's alive. He's not dead. To the living God. Look at this. Who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them? Acts chapter 14. Wow. Paul is going right to the source, taking these skeptics, and this is why I appreciate so much Dr. Martin talking about creation evangelism. This is what Paul is doing on Mars Hill. He's taking them back to Genesis. They're the ones that say, hey, we don't know anything about this God you're talking about, so tell us more. That wasn't always the case here in the United States. People were brought up, even though they may not have been born again, John chapter 3, they certainly knew about some of the biblical basis, the foundation, even though they had perhaps not ever made a profession of faith. And that's why there was such an incredible amount of people coming to Christ as a result of people like Billy Sunday and Billy Graham and many others, Spurgeon, as they came to Christ. In other words, they were ready to hear, to receive the wonderful message of Christ. They already had their, if you will, their soil prepared with using the parable of the 4 soils. They had their soil prepared. They understood. They just needed somebody to tell them about who Jesus is, and they were ready to become born again. The sea and all things that are therein. Let's look at an example. Japanese spider crab. It's found in 2 places, off the coast of Oregon, and where would be the second place? Japan. See how easy science is? Japan. Japanese spider crab can reach a leg span of 18 feet, claw to claw. Look at this, weighing how much? 40 pounds. It has a gentle disposition and can be raised in a really, really big aquarium. Well, 18 feet. You know, you're not going to put it in your goldfish bowl. A 40-pound crab, folks, I can only think of 2 things when I think of a 40-pound crab. Okay. So how about it? Let's look at this. Oh, by the way, crab have always been crabs. They're called crustaceans. They're part of the phylum Arthropoda. The arthropods, largest animal group in the world, according to the late Steve Gould. And so, yeah, they're crustaceans. They're arthropods. They have pair-jointed appendages and a chitinous exoskeleton, and boy, are they delicious. But how about shark evolution? Did sharks evolve? Well, no. Out of 850 species of sharks, ranging from the 49-foot whale shark to the 1-foot dwarf shark, Darwinists insist that sharks evolved from non-sharks in the past, but conflicting interpretations are the rule. I have quote after quote after quote by leading evolutionists who admit, to their credit, and I salute them, they don't know where sharks came from. Sharks show up in the fossil record as 100% sharks. Sharks have always been sharks. And I was emphasizing that up in the Pacific Northwest last year And there was an evolutionist in the crowd who was also a writer for a local newspaper. And he jumped on that, and he had a very intemperate and sarcastic and basically very rude evaluation of our seminar, weekend seminar there. Folks, all he had to do was give 2 or 3 facts of real vertical evolution, what we call macroevolution, and he could dispense with all of the attitude and all the negative input and everything else, and simply say, well, this presentation this weekend there in the Pacific Northwest was all about creation, but we know that evolution is a fact, and then just list them, 1, 2, 3 facts of real vertical evolution. But he didn't do that. He was very sarcastic. But anyway, he took issue with this slide here, but I had another one too, and I forgot to include it. But you can be sure sharks have always been sharks. I'm a scuba diver. I haven't scuba dived in years. But I really love to scuba dive, love to distance swim in the ocean and all that. But one thing that does terrify me are the cat sharks. And the cat sharks are terrifying, and you can hear them coming, and you just have to make sure that your life is right with the Lord, because they are really the cat sharks. We can have fun this afternoon, can't we? Okay, good. How about this? Crab-eater seal teeth. Look at that dentition. This is a special slide I made just for Dr. Martin. Crab-eater seal teeth. Okay, see how easy science is? What do you suppose this seal eats? And that would be 100% wrong. The crab-eater seals eat everything but crab. So who knows why that came up there. It's the most abundant seal species in the world. They do not eat crabs, but instead they strain krill. And here's the krill. And they use this formidable dentition that you see here to strain the krill out of the seawater. And I guess it's effective, because we still have crab-eater seal today. So it must work. Well, let's look at the features of the ocean. For example, the oceans are deep. In 1960, Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh and Jacques Piccard descended to the bottom of the Challenger Deep, more than 35,000 feet down, the deepest spot in the ocean. And since the slide was made, there also are some, since the slide was made, it was the son of Don Walsh. His name was Kelly Walsh. And he went down to the same place as his dad went down decades earlier. So I thought that was kind of neat. And here's a fun fact. As many people have been down to the bottom of the Challenger Deep as have walked on the moon. So that's how inhospitable the bottom of the ocean is, and how expensive it is, and how dangerous it is. And so really the final frontier is not so much space as just finding out what's at the bottom of the ocean. There are also undersea volcanoes. According to January 2022, this Tonga undersea volcano sent volcanic plume of ash 36 miles into the sky, the most powerful atmospheric explosion ever recorded. And we knew nothing about it. But that's according to scientists who have made an evaluation. A supercharged thunderstorm lasted 11 hours, spread across 150 miles of the southern Pacific Ocean. The caldera, that large depression was formed, was 500 feet below sea level. So it was really very much an incredible event that nobody ever heard about, because it was in the middle of the ocean. One of my favorite heroes of creation science is Matthew Fontaine Murray. He's the ocean pioneer. He wrote the first classic work of modern oceanography entitled Physical Geography of the Seas, published in 1855. Now, Murray was a naval officer in the American Navy. He suffered a catastrophic carriage accident, which put him in the hospital, and he had to convalesce for months. He was badly hurt. But he was a Christian. He loved the Lord. And he read God's Word daily. And in his devotions one morning, there in the Naval Hospital, he read Psalm 8, "Whatsoever passeth through the paths of the seas." Now, he believed that if Scripture said there were paths in the seas, then there were. And so he set out to find them. He contacted friends of his that were ship's captains. He contacted merchant mariners, and together they started to formulate some of these paths of the sea, these ocean currents. Now, we've known about ocean currents for generations and generations before Matthew Fontaine Murray, but he's the one that put the scientific investigation and the research on it and began to formulate some of these paths, putting together the paths of the sea. And they ended up making up a memorial for Matthew Fontaine Murray because of the incredible work that he did in the field of oceanography. And speaking of ocean currents, they can flow for thousands of miles, and together they can create the great flow of what they call the global conveyor belt, which plays a dominant part in determining the climate of many of the Earth's regions. And once again, this is what we say, the oceans are a heat sink. They help to buffer the extreme temperature changes that would otherwise occur. They don't happen because of the oceans. And of course, tides as well. Daily tides caused by the moon helps to avoid oceanic stagnation by mixing the waters, bringing oxygen to stagnant pools, and stirring up the nutrients thanks to a large part to the moon, which causes 2 tides per 24-hour period of time, ensuring that we have a very efficient mixing of the oceans. So the oceans account for 90% of the living space on this planet, not surprising since the oceans cover 73% of this planet. Only 20% of the ocean floors have been mapped out, just 20%. We still have 4/5 to go. So that's kind of interesting. How much do we know about the ocean? Well, there's much left to discover. As one lady said at the University of Southampton back in 2015, quote, we're still sort of in the Victorian age of the exploration of the deep seas. In other words, we know almost next to nothing. Why is that? Why is it that we've been to the moon and back? Why is it we've been sending out all of these spacecraft exploring the deepest regions of our solar system, and yet we know so little about the ocean? And there are numerous answers to that. Number one is, of course, the ocean is a lot more inhospitable than you realize. The fact that the deeper you go, the pressure really gets intense. It gets very, very cold right at the freezing point of water. It's very dark. And, of course, it's very corrosive. And so there's just all sorts of reasons why we know more about the area out there in space than we do about the ocean. But most importantly, who's going to pay for all that exploration? And believe me, it's expensive to make vessels that are able to withstand this crushing pressure and the temperature and able to light the way and to see what's down there. And so lots and lots of research needs to be done. What about the oceans of the Earth? According to the National Ocean Service, it's shockingly small percentage. Just 5% of the Earth's oceans have been explored and charted. Now, that's just the oceans themselves. We've charted quite a bit, or 20% of the actual bottom of the ocean, especially the ocean below the surface. The rest remains mostly undiscovered by humans. So the oceans really are an undiscovered frontier. More than 90% of the ocean's biosphere is deep, and most of this remains unexplored. The oceans host life at all depths and across the widest ranges of conditions, and they represent a huge reservoir of undiscovered biodiversity. For example, how about this? What's that? Have you ever heard of Fuzzy's Tacos? Okay, I guess you have them here in Maryland, but in Texas, we got it there. How about this creature here? Is that animal, vegetable, or mineral? And this is just recently discovered within the past 12 to 15 years. And one of my favorites is when they sent down over 2 miles in the special designed cage, and it got to the bottom there, and they opened it up, and through a process, they allowed animals to come in, and then they would close the cage and bring it back up. This is a creature that they discovered at the bottom of the ocean, just kind of looking around, and brought it back up. And you can tell from his expression, he is not happy at all. And this has been voted the most ugliest animal in the world, and I agree. So, yeah, there's some really strange creatures down there. This is a carnivorous harp sponge found in Monterey Bay in northern California. I've been there several times. We've seen only 1% of Monterey Bay, said one evolutionist writing in 2012, and is still one of the most well-studied regions of Earth in deep water. I can look over the waters of Monterey Bay Aquarium and imagine thousands of species out there yet to be discovered. And that's just one tiny area of the ocean that has been intensely researched and investigated. And still, he says, I can imagine there's thousands of species out there yet to be discovered. Wow. Do we have our work cut out for us or what? Well, folks, that brings us to the Genesis flood. Look what it says in Genesis chapter 6. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, and the earth is, here's the phrase, filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. And so here we find in Scripture that God is describing to us very, very clearly that in those last days, when God told Mr. Noah to build the ark, the earth was filled with violence. By the way, this phrase is found twice in one verse in the opening chapters of Genesis. And in 2 Peter chapter 3, for this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. Here we have the Apostle Peter agreeing with what it says back in the Old Testament as the writer describes to us the Genesis flood. So the Apostle Peter, who has lived with and was with the Lord Jesus during his 3-year ministry, is telling us very bluntly the same thing we read in the opening chapters of Genesis, that this planet experienced a worldwide flood. We would say the oceans are composed of Genesis floodwaters that God used to judge a world thousands of years ago. And this is what I'm getting at when ICR would sponsor tours of Grand Canyon. We would stand at the south rim of Grand Canyon looking out at an incredible vista. It quite literally is breathtaking. And we see this and we're amazed, especially as the sun sets in the afternoon, the various colors that come out of the sedimentary rock units that are highlighted. But it's sobering at the same time, is it not? Because we understand as God's people that God had sent a flood because the earth was filled with violence. And so it's very sobering, and that's why we have communion there on the edge of Grand Canyon just before taking the hike down. Genesis chapter 6 through 8 clearly teaches a flood of worldwide extent. A simple, straightforward reading of these chapters leads the reader to conclude that God had Mr. Noah prepare an ark to withstand a devastating, cataclysmic event. Indeed, there are at least 30 statements of the universal character of the flood and its effects in Genesis. Let me ask you something this afternoon. How many doors on the ark were there? There was one door in the ark, right? What did people have to do in order to escape God's judgment in those times? By faith, they had to walk through the door of the ark from a place of God's judgment to a place of God's peace and safety and refuge that was only found on board the ark. So all of a sudden now, this one door of the ark that people had to voluntarily walk through becomes a picture, does it not? It becomes a picture of no less than the Lord Jesus Christ himself. In John chapter 10, we read where Lord Jesus says that he is the door. John 10, he is the door. And so I think that'll preach, won't it? And so we find that the flood certainly was a universal effect, not a local Mesopotamian event. The worldwide mountain-covering deluge would have deposited most of the world's fossil-bearing rock. Not every last sedimentary rock layer that you see there. There are examples, of course, where there was some recent flooding in the not-too-distant past. But a vast, vast majority of the sedimentary rock units, especially as we see, for example, in Grand Canyon in northern Arizona. I just do get a kick out of evolutionists would tell us that all you have to do to cure your creationist convictions is go to Grand Canyon. Well, when you go to Grand Canyon, the first thing that you notice is at least half of the layers that evolutionists say should be there are not there. And so, yeah, you have these sedimentary rock units laid down, but the evolutionists say, well, there's a lot of rock layers that are not there. The most infamous of which is the Great Unconformity. The Great Unconformity, you can go to Wikipedia and check that out. 1 billion years of missing fossil evidence. I don't know about you, but I like to talk about what we see at Grand Canyon, not what we don't see at Grand Canyon. We could speculate endlessly about that. Let's talk about the rock layers we see. We believe those rock layers were laid down about 4,500 years ago due to the Genesis flood, and that there was no Grand Canyon during the Genesis flood. It was all filled in with sedimentary rock units. For the year-long flood, and towards the end of the flood, when the Genesis floodwaters came off of the North American continent, we find that the sediments that were part of Grand Canyon were still unconsolidated. That's a fancy word meaning still soft. And so as the floodwaters came off, you had this massive carving effect that carved out those rock layers that were laid down just months earlier. And so what we have is a very, very rapid carving that is probably unbelievable to watch that occur. Evolutionists, of course, deny this, and they say that Grand Canyon was carved out by the Little Colorado River, sand grain by sand grain, over 66 million years of time. I don't believe that. I think the physical nature of Grand Canyon indicates a lot of water over a short period of time versus the evolutionary explanation, which is just the opposite. Just a little bit of water over vast periods of time. So we would look at the geologic column and say this is not a record of almost 500 million years of slow, gradual accumulation of sediments for, as I say, about 500 million years. No, this is a record of the Genesis flood, 4,500 years ago, and the flood itself lasting approximately 1 year. So these rock layers were laid down rapidly as described in Genesis chapter 6 through 8. Just to give you one quick example, this has to do with a German ichthyosaur fossil. Was unusual in that it appears to have fossilized very quickly. I like that written up there in December of 2018. It says it was fossilized very quickly, preserving soft tissues before they have rotted away. What does that kind of imply? Maybe a very rapid accumulation of sediments over something like maybe a flood could do something like that. So it was fossilized very, very quickly, preserving soft tissues before they rotted away. It sounds like catastrophic flooding on a very large scale. Billions of nautiloid fossils are found in a layer within the Redwall limestone of Grand Canyon. I've seen this dozens of times. It is the most inaccessible of all the sedimentary rock units in Grand Canyon. It's just a vertical wall there. But this is where you find these nautiloid fossils. And the park rangers of Grand Canyon were ecstatic when just about 40 years ago, a geologist found not millions, but possibly billions. He had to extrapolate a bit, but evolutionists agree that there are probably billions of fossilized nautiloids in the Redwall limestone in Grand Canyon. Why do I say that the park rangers were ecstatic? Because before that time, really, Grand Canyon doesn't have any real fossils to speak of, except for maybe at the bottom in what's called the Cambrian sediments, which includes trilobites, which just happen to be some of my favorite arthropods, trilobites. And yet, they're finding the red wall limestone containing these nautiloid fossils. This layer was deposited catastrophically by a massive flow of sediments, mostly lime sand. So why is this significant? Because the guy who made this discovery was none other than Dr. Steve Austin of ICR. And he is a meticulous scientist. He's a peer-reviewed, his research has been peer-reviewed. He has left no stone unturned, no pun intended, but he did the work that showed that the nautiloid fossils are a ubiquitous part of the Grand Canyon fauna, the nautiloids, the fossils there of that area. And that was so exciting. The park rangers of Grand Canyon were ecstatic, but at the same time, they were very upset. Why? Steve Austin was a creationist. And so even though he had made this amazing discovery, they were very disappointed that he was a creationist. And so they kind of let it go. Now, if it was an evolutionist who found these nautiloid fossils, there would have been celebration. The champagne corks would be popping and confetti and everything else. We found a great treasure trove of fossils, but hardly anything was said because Steve Austin did not toe the party line of evolution. And Steve tried to get his research published in the prestigious Geological Society of America. They wouldn't touch it. You know why? Not because the science was so bad. I'd challenge anybody to show me where his science was bad as he did this research. I'll tell you why. It's because it had Steve Austin's name, comma, Institute for Creation Research in the write-up. And they said, that's it. We're not publishing it. Because there's such an insane bias against creationists. And so they just had to let it go. Is that good science? No, that's terrible science. That's terrible. But that's the sort of thing you kind of expect there. Well, this is one of the best quotes I've read about the Genesis flood. It was back in 2015. A new study shows that dinosaurs and other continental vertebrates remained diverse in Europe up until the asteroid impact there in the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago. Then the author went on to say, again, this is Science Daily, no friend of the creationist. They said, this is strong evidence that dinosaurs and many of their contemporaries, look here in the gold, in the yellow here, went extinct rapidly and simultaneously all across the globe. Folks, if I wasn't so old, I'd be doing some cartwheels across the stage here, because this is probably one of the most perfect descriptions of the nature of the Genesis flood. If somebody were to say to me, Frank, what's your evaluation of the Genesis flood? I would certainly say something very close to, well, it's where billions of animals went extinct rapidly and simultaneously all across the globe. Sounds like a flood to me. So I thought that was kind of interesting that they would say that. Something as yet unknown caused sediment to flood the areas rapidly. I like that. Yet unknown, maybe a flood, which helped preserve the plants. Then a researcher splits open a gray slab of siltstone, which is a type of sedimentary rock, in the quarry to reveal amazingly well-preserved Triassic plant fossils, as if the leaves and stems had been freshly pressed into the rock only yesterday. Wow. Do you need any more compelling evidence from the evolutionary community? This is all evolutionists who have no theological axe to grind, but they're saying things that so perfectly mirror Genesis flood evaluation. It really is quite exciting to read statements like this because it shouts flood geology very clearly. Well, these are some of the quotes that I'd mentioned earlier about evolutionists who now, and I appreciate them saying that this planet did experience a covering of water worldwide in the past. Evolutionists admit this planet could be covered almost entirely with water. Quote, we are talking about a time when, if you were looking at the Earth from space, you would hardly see any landmass at all. It would have almost been an ocean world. That's kind of neat. Oceanography by Tom Garrison. Garrison, is no friend of the creationist. However, some recent studies suggest that water may have covered the Earth's entire surface for some 200 million years before the continents emerged. Okay, I just simply eliminate those 200 million years and simply say that Garrison is saying, like we have been saying ever since Scripture has been published or written, that this planet was covered with water in the past. Tom Garrison, Johnny come lately, but that's okay, is now saying this planet was covered with water in the past. Who moved? Early Earth was covered in a global ocean and had no mountains. This is 2017. Earth 4.4 billion years ago was flat and almost entirely covered with water, just a few small islands, new research suggests. So, folks, we go on and on about this, but I think this is an exciting time in creation science, that evolutionists are now being drawn, screaming and kicking, to a kind of a quasi-biblical position, where they're now saying, yeah, this planet was covered with water, where they're now saying, yeah, this planet experienced a worldwide catastrophe. And we can only expect better things as time goes on. As they do their research, as they ignore God's word, no way they'd become a creationist if you talk to them. And yet they're coming to the conclusion just exactly what the Bible teaches. That's what's exciting. Is our position so unscientific? Not at all. Not when evolutionists are coming to the same conclusions. This is a time of rejoicing. So, folks, that's all I have on the ocean, because I wanted to end here very quickly so we can have a time of Q&A. So, let's go ahead and entertain some questions. Now, folks, I do want to say this, and I do this before every presentation, Q&A. We are the Institute for Creation Research. We're not the Institute for Creation Answers. Okay. So we're still researching a lot of this. So there's a good chance that I will not be able to answer your questions, because we haven't gone across that bridge yet. We don't know yet. But we're the Institute for Creation Research, and I'm going to preempt what somebody's going to ask, and that is the starlight and time. Let me say this about starlight and time. We don't have all the answers regarding the light travel from distant reaches of the space and all that. And I don't lose any sleep over it at all, because I want to say from the outset that guess who also has a problem with starlight and time? You would never guess this. The evolutionary community. Because if they subscribe to a Big Bang cosmology, guess what? They have the same problem we have regarding starlight and time. Anybody here understand fully the nature of gravity? No, nobody does. Gravity is a mystery, okay? How about the nature of light? Does light act like a particle, or does it act like a wave? Somebody said yes. That's true. Light acts like a wave and a particle. So nobody really understands the nature of light. And if you don't understand fully the nature of light and of gravity, and Einstein, as he tried to identify that using the theory of relativity, we still have a long way to go. And by we, I mean creationist and evolutionist when it comes to starlight and time. And so I like to go along with a young Earth creation cosmologist, Dr. Jason Lisle, who has his theory of what's called the one-way speed of light. Now, I won't go into it this afternoon because as I try and explain it, my head hurts. But it's called the one-way speed of light. And so Jason Lisle, I think he has his finger on the pulse there. And so we still have a lot of research to be done, but don't feel intimidated if we cannot fully describe or fully explain starlight and time. By the way, speaking of Jason Lisle, he made some predictions prior to the James Webb Space Telescope taking those deep pictures of deep space. And James Webb Space Telescope is unique because it investigates the far reaches of space from the context of the infrared, is it the ultraviolet? I think it's ultraviolet depths of space there. And the evolutionists had their prediction regarding finding these galaxies so distant in the past that they would be the young, immature galaxies. Jason Lyle made the prediction that they would be mature galaxies that they would see. Guess what? When the film was developed, as it were, they found mature galaxies, just as Dr. Jason Lyle had predicted. So these are exciting times. You know, we don't claim to know all the answers yet, but yeah, that's why they call us the Institute for Creation Research. Okay, let's go ahead and take any questions.
You talked a lot about water and
yeah.
the complexity of it, and could you just explain a little bit about the difference in density of water near the freezing point as compared with other liquids and solids?
Yeah. That's a good question regarding the nature of water. What makes water so unique, ladies and gentlemen, is something called hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding is an electrostatic attraction between the oxygen, which has a net negative attraction, and the hydrogen, which has a net positive attraction, and sets up these hydrogen bonds. It's kind of hard to explain, but hydrogen bonds are the reason why we can live, because our DNA molecule, as you have the spiral helix, the nitrogenous bases have hydrogen bonding that keeps the two sides of the spiral helix of the DNA molecule attached. And so when it comes to the nature of water, we find that water acts kind of in a peculiar manner as it approaches freezing point. Instead of becoming more dense and ice forming at the bottom of lakes and rivers and streams and all that, just the opposite happens. At that critical point of freezing, it becomes less dense and it floats. And how neat that just happened to work out, so that you know, we would have ice forming at the top, and if we had it the other way around, if we had ice that began to form at the bottom, well then pretty soon, within the space of just generations, you would have eternal ice underneath these lakes and streams and seas and everything else, but that doesn't happen. And so it's just one more way that would, I would say, verify. I'd say it's evidence, it's not proof of the creation model there. So I wish I can get more, and I do appreciate your asking that. So good question. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I have a really dumb question.
Oh.
You showed a lot of creatures, and one of them you showed in the middle between two others, and you said it was the ugliest creature ever found on Earth.
My favorite picture.
I just am really curious. What's the name of that creature?
Oh, I was afraid you'd ask. I'll call it Chirupus nidus. No, I don't know what the name of that is, but they really have voted that as being the world's ugliest creature because, you know, it's just a blob, but it still has an expression there. Kind of reminds me of Ziggy, that cartoon character. You know, I'm aging myself here, but yeah, I'm not sure what they call it, but it's just part of the fauna towards the bottom of the ocean. How little we know about the bottom of the ocean. It's still an unexplored area there. We don't need to go whizzing out in space there. All we have to do is look in the ocean.
Believe it or not. I believe that's called the blobfish.
That's it. That's a good scientific name. Okay. Good question. Yes, ma'am, in the blue shirt there. Yeah, global warming. Dr. Jake Hebert, PhD physicist here at ICR in Dallas, has some booklets and articles regarding global warming. To cut to the chase, we would maintain, first of all, I say this and people kind of snort in contempt and all that, but I'll say it anyway. I believe God really does have everything under control. Okay, and he does. He's got everything under control. And so, is there global warming? Well, I think, yeah, there is. We're beginning to see that. However, what we would maintain is it's a cyclic phenomena. And so this is a kind of a cyclic thing. And so what we would do is go ahead and check it out at icr.org. Type in global warming in our search engine. And I don't want to say this, I want to say the quiet, but Answers in Genesis, I think, also has a section on global warming, and you can check on their search engine as well. And do we have all the answers? No, we don't. And so, yeah, I think that there's room to maneuver. There's room to investigate and research and all, but I really do think God has everything under control. These are good questions, by the way. Good questions. Yes, sir?
Thank you for being here. I've really appreciated your presentations. I was here yesterday, so they were great. Given that young Earth flood models account for the geologic column that we observed today, why does the pre-flood rock described in these models contain microfossils? So in other words, why does perfectly created rock prior to sin and death have small dead things within it?
Yeah, okay, good question. And that is, we would have to investigate the nature of those microfossils as to, what they are. And I have no problem. Those microfossils have been fossilized maybe prior to the flood. All we have to do is look at, for example, the Mississippi River Delta and find that with the Mississippi River Delta, we have a kind of a swirl cake appearance of the sediments. And yes, there are sediments laid down in this great waterway called the Mississippi River, and we would not expect to find hardly any fossils there at all. And so, yeah, there are occasional fossils and all that, but this is post-flood. But when it comes to microfossils, I don't have any problem with these very, very small creatures being caught up and buried in there. We have to understand the nature of biblical life. For example, plants. Are plants alive in the biblical sense? No, plants are not alive in the biblical sense, and that's why we can have plants being fed upon in the pre-flood in the world before God cursed the earth. We could have animals, people crunching on plants, and it's true. They are not alive in the biblical sense, and that probably goes with, for example, bacteria and microfossils as well. So, yeah, I have no problem with that.
Thank you.
Okay.
I guess my question is, where did the extra volume of water come from to cover the earth, and then where did it go?
Okay, excellent question. Do we have any other question? No. Yeah, okay, what about that? Well, first of all, we would say that this water that we see today probably has always been on the planet, and this is a conclusion that now evolutionists are coming up with as well. So I think that's significant. Where did the water go? Well, it's always been in the oceanic areas there. We find that there was a lot of geologic work done during the flood year. Do we believe in continental drift? No. We believe in continental sprint. So there was a lot of movement of real estate in a short period of time. And orogeny is mountain building. And I'm an invertebrate zoologist. I know I'm limited and all that, but I've done a little bit of work in orogeny. It's amazing. Every one of the major mountain ranges in the world today have been formed, quote unquote, recently, according to geologists, secular geologists. And so with this orogeny, this mountain building with the upthrust and everything else, if you get an increase in the altitude of these mountains, you'd get a necessarily decrease into the depths of the ocean. And so all of the water would be essentially right there. And so there's still lots of work to be done there, but again, we don't have any problem with that. Back in the mid-1980s, I remember being in graduate school, and one of my fellow graduate students found out I was a creationist. I wanted to get through my master's program without getting into arguments and knockdown, drag-out fights with people and all that. And she wanted to know, and she was kind of irreverent about it, but where did all the water go? And it's the fact that the water's always been there. It's just changed physically the surface of the earth. So yeah, that's a good question. Oh, by the way, when it comes to mosquitoes, folks, mosquitoes are exquisitely designed, the female, I should say, to extract blood. And blood is a modified connective tissue, as we call it in zoology. Modified connective tissue, in other words, blood is made up of water and protein. Well, it just happens that the female mosquito needs protein to make her ova, that is, her eggs. And so the big question is, wait a minute, what about before, the fall of mankind and all that? What do those female mosquitoes eat? And the answer is, and this is what I had to have my students in zoology study. They had to recognize difference between the male head of a mosquito and the female head of a mosquito. The female head of the mosquito had these really wicked-looking surgical portions of it, the labia, the labellum, and all of that, in order to cut up into flesh to get at the blood there. Well, could those same structures be used, for example, in plants? Because although we have hemoglobin, which is the protein designed by the Creator to carry oxygen, there's a special kind of a hemoglobin in plants, and it's called leg hemoglobin. And so how would the mosquito get in there? Well, by using those surgical instruments. Remember, plants are not alive in the biblical sense, and she could slice in there and extract that leg hemoglobin. And so I think these are pretty compelling answers. And we're not saying it's the answer, but I think we're getting close to the source there. And so, yeah, you bet, the mosquitoes. A lot of people say to me, Frank, why didn't Mr. Noah just mash those 2 mosquitoes before they got on the ark? Problem solved. And I think about that for a while. But mosquitoes are a source of food for other animals, are they not? Yeah, you bet, you bet. It's too bad that they carry things like Plasmodium falciparum, which is malaria, the worst of the 4 species that you can get as a human. But yeah, so I like to center in, because that's my field, invertebrate zoology, and start asking the hard questions regarding, for example, the nature of mosquitoes and what do they eat before and after and all. And so I think these are some of I think they're maybe compelling answers to some of these questions here. Maybe one more and then we're done. No more questions? Okay. Did you have one? Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned, I think you said continental sprinting.
Yeah.
How do we account for the massive amounts of heat that would generate?
Yeah, okay, that's called the heat problem. Guess what? It's still a problem, all right? But the heat problem is right up there or right down there with the idea of light travel from stars. So we don't have all the answers yet, but this is why when people come to hear creation science seminars, I appeal to them, help us out. Yeah, if the Lord is directing you into the field of science, this may be a calling there. So yeah, there would be heat generated for that continental sprint there. But it's the heat problem, and I'll roll with it. For now, I think the answer is out there. I know it's not a satisfactory answer. I agree it's not satisfactory, but it is what it is. And I believe the answer is out there.
Dr. Humphreys is working on that as well. And
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's got some great work on it. And I'd explain it to you, but it's way up here somewhere.
Yeah, Russ Humphreys. Let me say this in conclusion. This is really kind of fun. In the mid-1980s, as my wife was pregnant with our first child, I left her in Colorado on her 9th month of pregnancy. Terrible thing to do. Guilty. And I went to Grand Canyon because I heard ICR was having a tour of Grand Canyon. And I loved ICR, and this was the first Grand Canyon tour, and I said, I'm going to go no matter what. And so I went to Grand Canyon, never been there before, and This lady, I called ICR in San Diego and said, I'm going to be there. And they said, okay, you're going to be one of the first ones there. So just wait at this area, this camping area, and then the bus from San Diego with all the other people will be there to meet you. And she said, oh yeah, there's also a guy from New Mexico who's going to be there too. And she gave me his name and all. And so I got there to Grand Canyon. And sure enough, I saw this blue little car drive up with New Mexico plates. And I thought, this must be the guy, Russ Humphreys. And so a lot of you don't know who Russ Humphreys is. He's a biblical cosmologist. He loves the Lord. He's got a sharp wit, and he's a dear friend. And so we had a wonderful time together. We just met each other and all that, and a good time, as we say in Texas, of laughing and scratching. And so it was a lot of fun, that first tour. By the way, it was called the Grand Canyon Death March, because the temperature got up to 125 to 130 degrees at the bottom of Grand Canyon. The wind would come across the walls of Grand Canyon, and it was not a refreshing wind. I remember when it hit you, it was like when you open an oven door, and you have that wave of heat there. That's kind of what it felt like. And so we ended up not doing the afternoon activities. It was just too brutal, and we would find various areas of Colorado River tributaries there at the bottom of Grand Canyon, and just float right there all the way up to our necks, and then we would talk and exchange ideas and all that for the whole afternoon, because it was just too hot for anything else. So I just thought I'd throw that out. Okay, are we done?
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Sherwin. And
All right.
oh, you want to do one more quick one? Baron, can you be quick?
Yeah, I'll be quick.
Sal.
Oh, thank you.
Sal's never quick.
I'm Salvador Cordova. I'm a assistant researcher to Dr. Sanford.
Oh, yeah.
My quick question is, those were lovely slides, and is there a collection of slides like what you had presented available at ICR?
The bad news is, no, there's not.
Okay.
The good news is, you send me a thumb drive, USB, and just say, attention Frank, and then the ICR address, and I'll get that to you.
And I just had one quick comment.
Uh-huh.
I want to thank ICR.
Mm-hmm.
40 years ago, longer, I was in high school, and I got a tract from the ICR that turned me into a creationist. So thank you for your work.
All right. Well, thank you, my friend. I do appreciate that. John Sanford and I are dear friends, and John is the one that came up with this idea of genetic entropy, and he wrote a book about it. And genetic entropy is really a challenge to evolutionary naturalism that says we came up from the apes over millions of years, when John Sanford is showing we're not getting better and better due to mutation theory, we're getting worse and worse. As a matter of fact, back in the 1950s, they were using phrases like genetic load, genetic burden. That implies a dragging down. Those are not creationist phrases. Those are evolutionary phrases. So we do suffer from this genetic load or genetic burden. A significant portion of our genome is corrupted by mutations. And unfortunately, we are passing those mutations on to the next generation. Thanks, Dad. But that's what happens. And so it's amazing that we can keep up with those mutations. I know that we can be here all day, but one of my favorite examples of creation, ladies and gentlemen, is found in your DNA molecule. We have 46 DNA molecules in our cells, and in each one of those DNA molecules, as you're sitting here this afternoon, the bad news is your DNA is being corrupted by what we call lesions due to cosmic rays coming in. Every 24-hour period of time, the DNA is becoming corrupted one way or another. That's the bad news. The good news is the Lord Jesus has created special, what we call repair enzymes. Enzymes, which are proteins, and this is where it gets, what's the scientific name? Spooky. This is where it gets spooky, because you've got these proteins that are colorless. They're like the white of an egg before it's been cooked. And so you get this mucilaginous protein, colorless, that's going up and down your spiral helix of your DNA molecule, But here's where it gets really spooky. It is programmed. This is a genetic, I mean, this is a protein molecule. How do you program a tiny subatomic protein molecule to be programmed to leave the good parts of your DNA alone, but to point out the bad parts of your DNA, and to call in a whole army of other proteins to repair that section of the DNA that's bad, and repair it by a biochemical process we call dehydration synthesis. And that's happening hand over fist in your DNA right now. It's being repaired and repaired and repaired as fast as it's getting corrupted by these mutation rays, these cosmic rays or whatever else. And it's going on now hand over fist all the time that you're alive there. But we are building up a mutation load, a genetic burden. But the Creator, I got to admit it, He's got everything under control, and He's designed these repair enzymes. And this is why, when on occasion I do have debates with evolutionists, front and center are those repair enzymes. How do you get the spontaneous formation of DNA when what you need to make the DNA functional are repair enzymes, which, well, just happen to be programmed by DNA. And so that's a chicken-egg paradox, a conundrum. That, and of course, soft dinosaur protein. I always like to bring that up too as well. Folks, we'll be here all night, which is fine with me, by the way, but we all have something to do, so.
Very
Jay.
good, Jeff. Thank you so much.
Okay.
So just a couple of items. Don't run off. We still have resource tables back there. You can still grab one of our speakers for questions. Let's see. Are you tired of hearing Dr. Sherwin and Dr. Martin, or would you like to hear them again? How about tomorrow night? It's listed in your program. They'll be at the Frederick Institute for Scientific and Biblical Research at Calvary Chapel Church in Frederick, okay, at 6:45, and they'll both be there tomorrow. And then Tuesday night, Dr. Sherwin will be at ISBR in Lancaster, PA, and Dr. Martin will be at ISB in Newark, Delaware. Okay? All right. Then lastly, we do need to pick up all of the chairs. So if anyone who can hang around for a minute and just, how high do you stack them? 6 to 8. Just make stacks of 6 to 8. 8. Okay, 8. We have dollies and whatnot to put them away. All right? Thank you all very much.